is of two different groups, the haves and the have-nots. The point that I want to make is illustrated by this graph here, which is that if you have a look at the distribution of wealth, and the income distribution in South Africa is the same. If you look at that distribution, you will note that the wealthiest 10% of South Africans have got 90 to 95% of wealth in South Africa. The poorest 50% have virtually no wealth at all. And this is really important as we start to think about how to achieve access, to ensure that when somebody's trying to get their child into a school in Gauteng and needs to go online, that they're able to do that, to ensure that people who need the most basic information in order to find out what jobs are available are able to do that. But the situation we have here is that we have such huge divides that even if there were to be an incremental reduction in the cost of data over the next 5 years, it's not going to begin to address the challenge of the bottom 50% of this population. We actually have to have pro-poor strategies. We cannot simply think that incremental or gradual decline in data costs is going to address the most fundamental challenges of South Africa. Now, let me just illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here. Is in terms of the National Broadband Policy of 2013, it stated that by 2020, that's just next year, all South Africans should have access to broadband at less than 2.5% of their monthly income. Less than 2%. Less than 1/40th of their monthly income should be spent on internet. As it stands at the moment, if poor people were to buy, say, 1 gigabyte of data, that would cost between a sixth and a third of their per capita monthly income. And I wanted to stress this point here, because we need to start comparing apples with apples. We need to start comparing a gigabyte with a gigabyte, a bundle size with a bundle size. And if you do that, you understand that the poorest consumers are getting the rawest deal. They're paying up to 10 to 30 times more for the data than the wealthier consumers. And this comes about through several ways. Firstly, prepaid bundles cost about twice as much per gigabyte as a post-paid contract. Secondly, your smaller bundles cost a lot more. And there are a number of, there's a couple of network operators that have been pushing 12 Rand per 30 megabytes as an affordable option for people who can't afford more. That works out at 400 Rand per gigabyte. Now compare that with 16 Rand per gigabyte. You can afford to buy 100 gigabytes of data that lasts them a year. The third problem is that obviously poorer people are more likely to run out of data, and as a consequence be exposed to higher out-of-bundle data rates. And the difficulty here is that the knowledge, they've been informed ahead of time that they're going to run out, is often not sufficient, and I'll come back to that. But the last point that I want to make is that the communication around what is an affordable bundle, what the data offerings are incredibly complicated, incredibly confusing for semi-literate people. And I use that word advisedly, but we need to understand that part of the challenge we're trying to address in South Africa is an educational one. And the data, the way that data offerings are presented is not comparing like for like. People can't easily distinguish one bundle from the next, and are at a huge disadvantage when it comes to making the decision. These are some of the fundamental issues that we have in South Africa when there are very, very few opportunities in South Africa for overcoming the structural divides that we have. This should be one of them, and yet we have done exactly the opposite we have in fact compounded the problem of structural inequality instead of using communication technology to overcome it. So this is just sort of giving you a sense, and I don't know if you can see it from the audience, but byte for byte, just looking at the equivalent price per gigabyte for a various of prepaid bundles and then contractual bundles. And you can see that, let's say you buy, go right to the bottom, RAIN, 200 megabytes, you're paying 50 Rand a gigabyte. That's the cheapest. But if you can only get a 15 megabytes or 30 megabytes, the unit price, the equivalent, apple for apples, is 660 Rand per person, per gigabyte. Now compare that to the contractual side. That's the prepaid. People who either don't have the who don't have the credit rating to be able to get a contract, who can't afford it, that's the prepaid. And then if you have a look at the price per gigabyte on the postpaid, the contractual side of it, you can see that the actual costs are far, far lower. Mr. Chairman, this is inequity that simply cannot be allowed to continue. We cannot have a situation where South African, poor people in South Africa, and by that I'm speaking about 50% of the population, are so discriminated against. It is intolerable. The next point I'd like to discuss is that mobile technology does provide the opportunity to leapfrog some of the structural barriers. And the point that I want to make in this next slide is that socioeconomic networks, communication networks, have an incredibly important physical power, and that is that they give superlinear returns to scale. We get increasing returns to scale when we've got socioeconomic networks that are large, that are able to tap into a diversity of ideas and of people. You actually get more out of that network. But we have tended to focus, as I'll come back just now, to focus on infrastructural scaling, and infrastructural scaling doesn't do that. It's just got sublinear returns to scale. And the consequence here, if I can just show you, is if we were able to effectively use mobile technology in South Africa, if we were to use it to generate and exchange goods and skills and knowledge right across the economy for everybody in South Africa, and those sort of connections itself would spark innovation. They'd reduce the cost of social innovation. They would provide access to the type of basic education that parents need for their children, that early childhood practitioners need, that teachers need, that nurses, social workers, and job seekers need. This is the opportunity that mobile technology presents in South Africa. It has made a massive difference to the development of South Africa. Yet, we have failed to exploit that opportunity for the poorest 50% of the population. So mobile technology should be a virtual bridge helping to cross some of these divides, but it's not. We know that there is a very high demand for data-light services, so we know there's a demand out there. But when we've tried to extend that to data-rich services for socioeconomic development, we've simply run out of steam. Why? Because people cannot afford to participate. So, as I described earlier, the D.G. Murray Trust and many other partners in the social space have tried to innovate. We've tried to use mobile to bring information and connectedness to groups of people who are marginalized. I'm just going to run through some of these initiatives that make use of mobile data. So Nali Bali, a national reading campaign, Reading for Joy, that aims to bring stories into the lives of children. You might have heard it on the radio. It's on all public radio stations. But we want people to be able to read those stories to their children in their homes. early reading, early literacy is absolutely crucial to development in South Africa. Yet it is constrained. Yet we can't use an obvious tool in the hands of parents to do anything about it. Smart Start. Smart Start is an early learning social franchise. People don't pay money for their children to go to early learning play groups and centers. We've together with 6 other funders, we've created this as a national network to show how early learning can go to scale. In South Africa, only a quarter of 3 to 4-year-old children are in quality early learning programs. Only a quarter are in quality learning programs. Now imagine if we had this tool, both to be able to engage with parents, but to engage with practitioners, with early learning practitioners around the country, supporting them, strengthening them, teaching them more, helping them to engage more and more, develop the quality of these early learning programs in South Africa. It's an opportunity, it's an obvious win that simply cannot be done. Funza. Funza is a program, a mobile app and a website for teenagers. You know, I don't know if you're aware, but there are virtually no books, there's no reading material for children in townships. Yet Funza has 60,000 readers every single month who download one chapter and just hugely enjoy both being able to read and being able to write and contribute the stories of their own. But Funza is quite clear. They could get to 200,000 if they didn't have to face, if young people did not have to face the constraints of mobile costs. Job Starter. Some of you may know of Baba Jobs in India, which is this incredible connector, this vibrant connector of job seekers and job providers. It's stimulated the markets. It's addressed information asymmetries. It's created a more efficient market in Bangalore and other parts of India. We need to do the same in South Africa. We need to be able to start making these connections both in the social sector and in the formal economic sector. Job Starter is a mobile platform for doing that. It provides online learning opportunities for young people, just basic workplace preparation, what to do when you go to a job interview. All of this requires some data. We can't provide it. Young people have to get it themselves. And so the usage of a Job Starter is constricted. Activate. Activate is a national network of 3,500 young innovators across the country. Koketsa Moeti presented this morning. She's one of the youngest activators, one of these incredibly dynamic young people. Some from Bochum, Bizana, Jan Kempdorp, Joburg, Cape Town, that really need to create a national cohort of public innovation in South Africa that are dealing with local problems in their communities, but also need to feel that they're part of a network, that they can connect. And we've seen the tremendous power of those connections when the 60% of those activators who've got access to data, just how powerful that connection is. And we've seen how the 40% who don't have access to data miss out. Those are some of the public benefit organizations that have been developed that are just absolutely critical to the transformation of South Africa. Sitting there on the cusp of being able to do incredible things in terms of transformation, in terms of one of the biggest pieces in South Africa that's missing, which is the education, preschool education, and then finding ways to connect people into jobs. That human capital development pipeline, and we sabotage it. Government services also are providing crucial mobile services. I mentioned Mom Connect. Mom Connect is a service that provides SMS connection to 800,000 pregnant women every year in South Africa. It's funded by private donors. It's of obvious benefit. It's an SMS a week, but the cost when you've got 800,000 people is just too expensive to sustain. So this is the challenge. We have the pieces of the puzzle that just need to fall into place. We just need people to stand up and say, wait a minute, let's get out of our corners. Let's all commit to a public good. And all it requires is making a few little tweaks. And I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to show you through the recommendations, that some of these recommendations actually won't even cost the mobile network operators a cent. I just want to point out that we have lost opportunity over the last decade in the way that we have used universal service obligations and the SED obligations of BEE codes. They haven't been used, they haven't spoken to the specific advantages, the specific market advantages of mobile technology. I mean, it just absolutely boggles the mind that you've got a tool here, mobile, that could be in the hands of every single South African. You could find ways to bring in information. You could find ways to connect from pregnancy right through early childhood development into education, into adulthood, into job mediation. And yet, the network operators have been told to bring broadband into schools. Now, I'm not saying that's not important. Of course it's important. But you're actually not using their strength. I mean, the network operators have been paying for hardware in schools instead of actually tapping into this incredible strength that they have. And as far as we can work out, it's been very, very difficult to sustain that hardware. It's very difficult to be able to see what has actually been achieved for the investment in SED over the last 10 years in terms of the network operators. Now, I may be speaking out of turn. We may not have that information, but that information should be public. We should know exactly from government and from the network operators, we should know what has transpired, what that funding has been spent on, and whether those programs of wiring up schools are functional. We need to know that this is an investment. It's a considerable tax in South Africa, and we need to know that there's an efficiency in it. But our argument is that that's not where network operators should be. We've got to confront the fact that the unemployment rate among 15 to 34-year-olds in South Africa is over 50%. They're not in schools. They're not in jobs. They're not in clinics, except for maybe 2 or 3 or 4, 5 days a year. They're in their home. They're in spaces where they're actually feeling totally isolated. And it's not only an informational isolation, but we know that one of the challenges in South Africa is the psychological isolation of young people. The type of marginalization that drives HIV, that drives crime, that drives domestic abuse. These things are connected. And we've got to stop seeing mobile data simply as a way to bring about information. It's a way to bring about an exchange. It's a way to connect South Africans together. It's part of the fundamental transformation of this country that ultimately will reduce crime, HIV, and domestic abuse. So what can we do about it? And I'd like to say that we fully endorse the call to reduce the general cost of data in South Africa. But as I've shown you, because we have such a polarized society, because we've got such extremes of society, the market is not going to work effectively, even if we were to achieve a 20% reduction in the cost of mobile data. We have to have appropriate strategies. There have to be affirmative strategies. And I'd like to mention 3. The first is that it would be very easy and virtually at no cost to zero rate mobile data costs for the users of some of those specific applications that I put up on the board, and many others. It could be done, and I'm going to show you how. That would not only increase access, but it would spark innovation in South Africa. It would reduce the cost of innovation. DGMT is a funder, and I know that I speak for a lot of other funders. We're very reluctant to put any more money into mobile applications for development in South Africa. Why? Because we know that you're going to see a growth, and then you're going to see a plateauing. So why make that sort of investment? If we could start to overcome that, there's going to be new investment into the space, reducing the costs and increasing investments for social innovation. The second is that we have to address these specific pricing. We have to address specific pricing strategies that stop putting poor consumers at disadvantage. And finally, as I said, we've got to find some way to account for the real costs and benefits of the statutory obligations on network operators over the last 10 years. Why? Both because we need accountability, but secondly, because we need to start designing a more efficient service going forward. Now, imagine if you're a user who wants to connect to Nalibali. If you could make that connection, get onto the sites, or onto the Mobi site and onto the website, and that story that you want to tell your child costs you nothing. Why? Because the network operator is picking up the cost of that, and then that cost to the network operator is offset against their SED obligations. They already have, 1.5% of net profit after tax that they have to commit to socio-economic development, that they're putting in hardware in schools. Why? Why not have a situation where the network operators, working together with players such as ours, creates a social innovation register, and we've already put up 10 million rand on the table to say, let's get it started. It's not going to be high cost. Have a social innovation register where public benefit organizations and government mobile services could be registered. So you create a mechanism for screening, for vetting, for compliance, to make sure that the PBOs are doing what they say they're doing. You're able to monitor progress over time. You're able to contain the zero rating only to the services that are provided on that site. If people want to click onto a link that takes you out of that site, a little pop-up says to them, you're going to start paying now. And those services, the cost of those services get reverse billed back to the network operator, who then offsets them against SED obligations or universal service obligations. Can it be done? Yes, of course it can be done. You know how easily reverse billing is now happening in the commercial space. And I'm glad to say that there are network operators that are stepping up to the plate and saying, we should be doing this. I know we have a representative of RAIN in the room. And RAIN has started to do this with us, has taken 4 or 5 of these public benefit organizations, worked through the teething problems, now has the prospect of zero rating for these PBOs. NTN, at its highest level, at EXCO, has also committed to do so. Unfortunately, they've not yet followed through on actually implementing it. But I'm really hoping that after this service inquiry and NTN representatives in the room, we'll be able to go back and ensure that the group EXCO commitment to zero rating of public benefit organizations will be carried through. And we will be approaching the other network operators as well. This is a win-win. This is a logical thing. I mean, we shouldn't even be talking about this when we understand the potential gains for South Africans. And the fact that this can be done at almost zero cost, except for sustaining a social innovation register over time, which will cost about 6 or 7 million rand and should be provided through the Universal Service Access Fund. What about the specific pricing strategies to stop poorer consumers being disadvantaged? Well, let's just put it up there. And I know that the network operators will say that there are differential transaction costs, that things are not quite as clear-cut as this. I know that. But there's no way that the price differentials that are presented earlier, prepaid twice as much as postpaid, a 30% difference in the cost of a gigabyte between those who get smaller bundles and bigger, 30 times, 3,000% difference between the those who can afford smaller bundles and those who can't. You can't say that it is simply due to additional costs. No, it cannot be true. So we have to have a look at these. We have to work towards making the unit price of prepaid and contract data the same. Why must prepaid consumers be charged so much extra? We need to ensure that there's not a price differential just because you can only fork out for 30 megabytes. We've got to ensure that there's the same unit price per gigabyte. Now, that's not anti-competitive. You can still compete against the price of that gigabyte, but we have to stop disadvantaging the poorest. I spoke about the fact that the poorer people tend to incur higher out-of-bundle rates because they just don't have the money to keep topping up. ICASA has now stated that there must be a rollover period at the end of a month contract, but hasn't specified how long that rollover period should be. It should be at least 3 months to ensure that the people who bought data are able to fully expend their bundle. People need to be forewarned when their bundles are going to expire. And I know it's been done to some extent, but it's erratic, and often it comes as a surprise to poorer people when they exhaust 100% of their data and start to incur out-of-bundle costs. There's got to be a more transparent, clearer, more uniform way of alerting people that you've used half your bundle, you've used 80%, you've used 100%. And finally, the network operators have to find some way to achieve a uniformity of comparison for consumers. Consumers who find it very, very difficult to navigate their way through the dense and confusing permutations of network bundles. There must be, even if it is 2 or 3 clear comparators, cost of a gigabyte, whatever those are, those maybe need, in fact, to be decided and determined by the Competition Commission or others to ensure greater clarity, greater communication, greater ability of people to make informed choices, because at the moment they're not able to do that. And finally, as I said, we need to know where all the money has gone for universal service obligations and SED obligations. We need to know from the network operators, from DTI, how that money has been spent, and whether those services are still up and running. We know that the money's been invested in hardware and in software and connectivity. Is it still working? Let's have an honest appraisal of that. But then let's say we need to start to find ways to use the unique advantage of mobile technology to its fullest to overcome the digital divides in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison.
Thanks very much. You've answered some of my questions already, so I'll just focus on a few things. In terms of your pricing recommendations, so to have no difference between contract and prepaid, and also the unit price for all data bundles being the same regardless of size. And maybe just before I get there, in your written submissions, you also talk about a 50 Rand per gigabyte figure as kind of a best case scenario, a target for the unit price that you should see across, what the unit price that you should see across all consumers regardless of the bundle. The question is, how did you arrive at that 50 Rand per gigabyte? So what's the thinking behind that?
Thank you. Just around the 50 Rand per gigabyte, that was an article that was in my broadband that one of the network operators said, look, if spectrum becomes available, we can drop data prices to 50 Rand a gigabyte. So from the current 100, 60, 150 Rand a gigabyte, actually it's probably 149, they said, release the spectrum, we can make data prices 50 gigabytes. So we said, fantastic, that's a step change that we're looking for. I think that is one of the steps that we're hoping for. But the next thing is saying that is not enough. That's still 5% for 1 gigabyte of people's income. And why should people only be allowed to use 500 megabytes or 1 gigabyte of data? You can argue that someone that needs to get educational content needs at least 2 to 3 gigabytes of data per month to get access to that educational content that can help.
And then just following up on that, I mean, are you saying that there's no role for any kind of volume-based discount, or are you saying that volume-based discount should only be strictly cost-related, or are we saying something else?
Look, I think volume-based discount, sure. When I buy a kilo of skip, I pay a little bit more than I do 2 kilos, and that price differential is maybe 10, 20, 30%. So we got a 3,000% price differential at least, right? So, one of the cheapest ways of getting data out there, I think, is it's below. It might be 10 rand a gigabyte, but let's call it 16 rand a gigabyte. I pay 16 rand a gigabyte because I buy 100 gigabytes at a time for 1,600 rand. It lasts me a year. But other people are paying 667 rand. I mean, do the math. That is not acceptable. I think that is, you are targeting the poor, you are taking advantage of the poor. Sure, maybe the differential should be 30%, 40%, but certainly not 3,000%.
May I just add there? I mean, I think clearly, and not be privy to the cost structure, but clearly if there's a cost-related saving, and I've alluded to the transactional costs, the sales costs. If there are other potential cost savings, then again, that's comparing apples to apples. What I am saying is that having taken all of those cost considerations into account, in a country like South Africa, I do not understand why there should be a volume-based discount for something like data.
All right, thank you. And then in your written submissions as well, you talk about, I'll just quote what you say, until mobile data prices fall to below 15 rand per gigabyte, regardless of the amount of data that is bought, mobile data will remain unaffordable to the majority of South Africans. So the question is just how you got to that 15 rand per gigabyte. Is that just a percentage of an income level?
That's roughly a percentage of an income level. It just assumes that people should at least have a 1 to 2 gigabytes per data, and that should be below 2.5% of the income, based on the 992 rand per month income that people, but 55% of South Africans have. So it allows people to buy 1 to 2 gigabytes of data at less than 2.5% of their income.
Thanks. And then, just in terms of some of those public benefit organizations, which I understand the majority of those are yours or initiated by DG Trust, is that right?
Yes, those are the ones that I was happy to speak about. There are many, many others.
Okay. Do you have any sense of, I know people have to pay for that data, the data to use those apps now. Do you have any sense of the kind of average usage for someone who's using the reading app you mentioned, the job connect site? I mean, you're talking about 1 or 2 gigabytes that a person should be able to have. But do you have any numbers at hand in terms of how much data people are using on these apps? They have to pay for it.
Yeah, so some of the kind of less data-rich apps that you're not streaming video content is about 1 to 2 megabytes per 15 minutes of dwell time. And then obviously when you start streaming video content, and I speak under correction, it's about, depending on the quality of the video, about 5 megabytes per minute. So if you want to have an hour's worth of streaming, that would be 300 megabytes. So you very quickly use up 1 gigabyte. It gives you maybe 3 hours of streaming in an entire month, depending on the efficiency of the data and of the data streaming.
Okay, thanks. And then I suppose the question goes further is to understand how much a typical person uses on one of these apps. And if you don't have the figures now, it's fine. Maybe we can communicate after this. But suppose it would be interesting for us to know that when people are paying, how much they're using in total. So understanding how much they've used, if they use X amount of time is useful, but also just to understand for, I think you mentioned the Funza app, 60,000 people, how much is that, how much data is each person actually using? Because that also gives us a sense, or whether it's a regulator, whoever it might be, of what this could cost, kind of proposals that you're making.
Yeah, we have those calculations somewhere, but yeah, again, it very much depends on video content versus non-video content, because that's we'll look into that and get back to you on that.
Okay, thanks. And then, in terms of the public benefit organisations that go on the register, do you have any sense or view on how that gets decided? I don't know if there have to be a regulated decision. I mean, you could put hundreds of apps, 10 apps, and obviously you have a lot more apps that would cost a lot more. So how do you envisage deciding which apps are the most valuable, which ones get put into that zero rated recommendation?
So I would say that at the moment there are probably about 40 or 50 mobile applications that are ready to be used, or ready to be to apply to this. Now so our view would be that there are specific criteria in terms of the public benefits activities that are provided by these organisations that that PBOs would need to comply with. So I mean, obviously, firstly, we're using PBO status because that's the first hurdle that needs to be crossed. That means that SARS has already identified these organisations as providing public benefit activities. Secondly, there would need to be specific commitments in terms of compliance, and our view is that there should be that public that social innovation register could be set up. It itself would screen the organisations, but that the actual the capping would happen in concert with the network operators who would say, for example, that they're willing to free up, say, 1% of their SED cost to this social innovation register. That capping would then allow us to apply certain caps to any particular organisation in terms of its usage, obviously, you know, we would need to ensure that there is fair spread across those organisations. But there is a limit. There's an ability to build in a limit and basically say to these organisations that we're going to throttle your ability to use the free data once you've reached 300, 400 gigabytes in a month, for example.
Right, and then last question from my side. You talked a bit more detail here than in your written submissions, but this idea of government providing an account of the costs and benefits of the universal service and SED obligations. Am I understanding right in that you're saying that if mobile operators are going to be effectively putting money into something along these lines, in these obligations, it makes more sense for them to do something that fits within what they do, so it's a mobile app rather than investment in fixed infrastructure, investment in schools. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right, and I think it should be extended beyond mobile. I mean, I do think that there should be an alignment, a greater alignment between what companies are forced to do and their own business, because we're simply not capitalising on it.
Okay, I think that's fine from my side. Thanks.
Mr. Mahon. Just one question on your recommendation to make the unit price of prepaid and contract data the same. The question is, do you know countries where this is currently happening, where the unit price of prepaid and contract data is the same? And two, if that's the case, was the regulation intervention or is it something that they did by themselves?
We don't know that. We'll have a look into that. Just an example, many years ago, contracts, voice data, for want of a better word, was a lot cheaper than prepaid. These days it's much more aligned. So obviously there's been a lot of progress in South Africa on making sure that prepaid and contract voice minutes, as they call it, is now the same finally, but there used to be quite a large disparity in rules.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Harrison, for your time as well as for your submission. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody for your attention.
Thank you.
We will now take the next presentation from the media monitor. Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. If you could just please state your name and surname for the record, and after that, we may proceed to take the oath of office.
Thank you, Chair. I'm William Bird, I'm Director of Media Monitoring Africa. I'm joined by my colleague, head of our policy program, Tandi Smith. So I, William Bird, swear that the evidence that I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Good afternoon, I'm Tandi Smith from Media Monitoring Africa. I'm head of our policy program. I, Tandi Smith, swear that the evidence that I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you.
If I may begin, Chair.
Yes, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much. So we're going to do it as a double-hander so that you don't just have to listen to me. So we represent Media Monitoring Africa. It's clicky. This is about who we are. We're a non-profit NGO, one of the public benefit organizations. David Harrison would support some of the stuff that we do. In fact, they do. We spend a lot of our time monitoring and doing policy submissions on a variety of media policy-related issues. We often speak to the regulator, CASA, as well as the Portfolio Committee on Communication. Also done submissions recently on the Copyright Amendment Bill. And we work closely with a range of other government entities. And so we bring a very clear, biased approach to this, which is that we're informed by a human rights approach in what we speak about, and it informs all of the work that we do. So to give you a bit of an overview of our presentation. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is getting the foundations right. Then my colleague Tandi will talk about access to information, presenting our 7-point plan, which is something that we've been working on together with other partners, the other partners being APC, which is the Association of Progressive Communication, which is an international NGO that focuses on these very issues, as well as the South African National Editor's Forum. And the IAB, which is the Interactive Advertisers Bureau of South Africa. And then we're going to look at concrete steps towards bridging a digital divide, so to look at some things that we work on. So the first point of departure is that currently South Africa is a disaster when we look at digital. The last time we counted, there were about 4 or 5 different processes running at one time. as it is, we still left with one of the worst hangovers. Our president decided to wake up with one day and split our Department of Communication into two departments. So while the rest of the world was converging, he thought that divergence was a good idea. Lord above knows only why. And the after effects of that are going to be with us a long time, until hopefully they get merged after the next elections, and then we'll deal with the chaos that ensues from re-merging. Nonetheless, what is clear is that there's no coherence. We don't have our last broadcasting policy was done in 2008, 10 years later, we're still doing it. We've changed our ministers more times than many people change their underpants, which is deeply embarrassing to us as a nation. It means that our broadcasters and those in the media sphere have no policy certainty, that find it very difficult to operate, and it's really unfair for them and their business models. We see when we deal with policy, the Department of Justice is looking at the cyber security bill. You've then got the Film and Publications Amendment Bill, and you've then got the ECA Amendments Bill, and all of those being looked after by different departments. And many of them have a lot of overlap, which is often disastrous. In the last meeting, they talked about this as double padlocking, which is just completely bizarre. It means that people could be found guilty of the same crime under two different pieces of legislation. And you can imagine the hazard that that would present. And so even in things like the NDP, there's no real kind of coordinated sense. The first positive sign we've had came from our president, who announced that we needed to have a multi-stakeholder fourth industrial digital revolution commission, which we're still waiting for. As I understand it, some of those things have been tasked to the DOC, which is the Department of Communication. Sadly, a lot of the problems there seem to arise that they like to have consultants, although you would have thought that we would have learned our lesson of using consultants, but still. So what we believe we need is a clear, coherent digital policy to inform where we can go. And that means we must have a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approach. If you look around the world at digital policies, this is the way that these things are working in countries where they have a coordinated idea. In the countries that are most advanced and most developed and reaping the most benefits from these things is where they're working together with them. We can't spend our time either trashing the mobile operators or trashing government. If we have to work together to get these things to talk to each other. It means departments can't operate in silos. And so this process, while very distinctly focused on the market impact issues and the things that determine it, must be part of something that has to take this kind of approach into account. Otherwise, it's going to just be another process that will fail. We've seen numerous efforts to try and bring down data costs, and very often these things haven't worked, and we have to ask why that is. I don't believe it's because the telecom operators are all just greedy pigs who are obsessed only with profits. You know, those people live and work in South Africa for the majority of them, and they understand these things. So we have to understand what it is that we can do to get these things to improve in a real and meaningful manner. Similarly, we cannot allow this nonsense that market forces must determine it, and based on that, you know, if we do that, it will fail. So hence we argue that the policy that we need must have at its basis the following. Public interest must be paramount. We can't have this idea that profit above all. If we want that, we can bring in Donald Trump as our next president. We also must have this idea of there being a deliberate effort to bridge the digital divide and combat inequality. What we see with technology is this idea that it has this potential for democratization, for bridging inequality and bridging digital divides. It only does that if you make very clear, very deliberate efforts to do so. Otherwise, the power dimensions and power structures that you find outside in society will replicate themselves exactly the same way as they are in society. In other words, you'll find that your very small elite continue to be the very small, very powerful elite. Inequality continues unless we make very deliberate efforts to address that. We also recommend that the policy is in line with the African Declaration on Internet Rights and the processes that are there. So we'd like to see far more of a rights-based approach to understanding these issues, because ultimately these things are about realizing rights. We also believe that marginalized interests must be put forward, and that's not just about the rich versus poor, that is about also marginalized people, women, children, in particular young people. And that all of this must work to realize the rights in our Constitution.
When we talk about data costs, one of the key issues that come to the fore is around access to information. It's not, we speak about access to information as lying at the heart of the issue, and the element that has the immediate impact on data costs. As William mentioned before, we partnered with various other organizations, including APC, SANEF, and IAB, to work on a position paper that deals with access to information. The position paper is called Perspectives on Universal Free Access to Online Information in South Africa, Free Public Wi-Fi and Zero-Rated Content. In the paper, we unpack a 7-point plan that, for the organizations involved, will achieve what we feel is universal access. So the first point is the commitment to the implementation of free public access to internet at government sites. And when we talk about government sites, we mean schools, libraries, health facilities, and such. And a point was made earlier about the fact that we can't just rely on schools to have these sites of free internet, that it needs to be a far more wide-reaching facility. However, this does require a lot of oversight and monitoring by appropriate bodies. The second point is that zero-rated access to government websites and data. This is something that's already been envisaged in the e-government policies. It's not something new. The third point that we discuss is that free Wi-Fi access should be regarded as a basic municipal service, and this should then be run as a public utility. But again, this relationship has to be a multi-stakeholder approach as well. It's not just reliant on public or private, but a partnership between the two. And we also talk about making it a requirement for commercial operators to provide free Wi-Fi in poor areas, and for the right to provide for those operators to provide the services to business and affluent areas. The fourth point is about setting minimum standards for the provision of free internet access, and this includes
Sorry, just to interrupt. I think you're not moving to the next slide. Next.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So we're on point 4. Point 4 is about setting minimum standards for the provision of free internet access, which includes for all commercial offerings a minimum data allocation per person per day, and the standards for privacy, security, access, quality, and fair access to information in the public interest. In the previous slide, one of the foundations that William spoke to was the fact that we have to approach all of these policies and all of these points with a clear public interest approach. The fifth point is about introducing the concept of my internet rights, or my I right. And this speaks to the fact that every citizen should be entitled to a daily amount of free internet access. An example is 500 megabytes per day. The previous presentation spoke about how much data is actually viable for access to basic information and educational material. And 500 megabytes per day, I think, it's not an insignificant amount to need. And so it's already the standard for many free Wi-Fi schemes. But this should be the minimum to exercise access to information rights. The sixth point is around digital literacy programs, and the fact that program across all educational curriculum. So for us, the introduction of a digital literacy program is should be part of the free internet schemes, especially aimed at children and those unfamiliar with risks and opportunities related to the internet. William also pointed out previously that when we speak about marginalized groups, we don't just talk about children, but we need to include other groups such as women as well. The last point is looking at the need for oversight bodies and the realization that what we're calling for when we speak about universal access won't have effective implementation unless you have the correct oversight bodies to monitor and report on these issues and on the progressive realization of these rights. We have bodies that exist, such as the South African Human Rights Commission, that would be in a position to do so. So when we talk about oversight, we speak about the particular adoption and implementation of legislation, regulation, and policies governing free access. And I think as a last point, just to emphasize the fact that the internet should be considered a basic human right and a facilitative right to all other rights underpinning these processes.
Thanks. So we wanted to wrap up with a couple of concrete steps, and this is some of the work that we're involved in to show that these things are possible. We're currently working with all these partners, and there are a couple more that we'll be adding next year, to all pull in the same direction around trying to encourage and make sure that young people in particular are aware of how to not only be safe online, but to realize and use the real power and potential of what it means to be a digital citizen. And this is basically on the assumption that in as much as this is about data services themselves and looking at and following the money, unless you provide that with and it's supported with the necessary digital literacy and critical literacy skills, we're just exposing people to a whole range of other problems that we're going to rue the day that we did that. For the simple reason that when you get to drive a car, you don't just jump in the car and drive. There's a whole process. You have to learn the rules of the road, etc. And being a digital citizen is no different from that exact same process. And here, these different partners with very different and competing interests are at least managing to work together to pull in the same direction. As far as we're aware, this is one of the only partnerships of its kind where we've got government, private sector, civil society, and mobile operators all supporting the same kind of initiative towards the same idea. So these things are eminently doable and eminently possible. And when they are, they can yield marvelously wonderful results. The other thing is to look at community Wi-Fi networks, and this is also about shifting the understanding and approach generally to how people get access to the internet. So there are a lot of focus, for example, on free Wi-Fi and these big things like we've got in China here, which is very nice, but when the government doesn't pay the bill, they cut the service. And what did we see just a few weeks ago? Suddenly all those students who were relying on it just in the lead-up to exams were left shortchanged because they didn't have suddenly they had no access. This is similar to people understanding how the new world works. You give people access and the ability to control their ability to shape their access to the internet. This is not something bizarre. This is something that every wealthy person can do. If you're wealthy, you have the power to determine how you want to access the internet because you've got a choice of any number of providers. You can go with fixed line, fiber, mobile, satellite, any number of things, whereas people that are underserviced generally don't. And yet we also need to make sure that they can have the power and ability to control their access. This is how you drive equality. It's about making sure that you put exactly the same tools in their hands. And what Shikamoto does is this, is we set it up with an early childhood development center in Villa Lisa, which is just here on the East Rand. And we did it there because we found that at the start of the month, the women who run some of the play groups, they've got enough money for their WhatsApp and they send the information around. Towards the end of the month, they don't have money and they have to walk around to go and ask and invite people to attend these things. We also found that there are people there that understand the internet, but not in a way that is necessarily giving them the benefit. So they know how to do a Facebook and YouTube and all these things, and the mobile operators gladly want them to because it uses more data, but they don't know how to use the internet to make running their schools easier, to have standard registration processes. All these kinds of things that would make their lives a lot easier are skills that they desperately need. And in fact, in working with these communities, we find that this is something that they're wanting to use. So Sikamoto is a community network that is run and set up there, and it allows people that are on that network to access both the internet and internet-like services, and we're happy to go into detail as to how it works. But the point is that it means that we're giving people in underserviced areas the ability to control how they get access to the internet, and starting to put them on a level footing, or a more level footing than other people. And the only difference between them and the people in this room is that they earn a lot less money than us. And that doesn't seem fair or appropriate. It's certainly not in line with our constitution. Now this morning we know that you would have heard some very excellent inputs. I'm sorry we weren't able to be here, from the likes of Amanda Moby as well as Research ICT Africa. Would have, I'm sure, given you accurate data, and the stuff that David presented earlier I hope is useful. I don't think that we need any real motivation for reduction of data costs. I think that seems pretty much of a no-brainer. But that what we do need is to think about the overall framework and how it needs to bridge the digital divide and combat inequality. And as much as the other issues are there, we have to address that and deal with that, because if we don't, we're failing our constitutional obligations. Our government fails, our big corporates ultimately will fail. And that, if you look at it, a more equal society serves the interests of all, because if you've got poor people who can afford more cool and better phones and better apps and all of these things, that's a lot better than having half the people who struggle just to make ends meet. Again, it's ultimately in the interests of all of us that we have a more equitable society. So it cannot also be only about cost, but it must be about the approach that we take. So it can't be about these debates here being determined ultimately by the powerful, the vested interests. It must be about the public interest. It can't be about what government necessarily wants. Government is there to represent the public interest. It can't even be about what you want as the Competition Commission. It must be about the public. This is about the people that live in our country, not necessarily about those that are lucky enough to be here. So it must be driven by human rights, and it must also look at providing critical skills, especially for the marginalized. So again, it is about the cost, but it must also be about ensuring that people have the skills in order to engage. The people in this room can multitask. I was trying while my colleague was speaking, I failed dismally, but we have that ability, and if we're going to succeed in the next 15 or 20 years, every one of our citizens needs it, because if we don't, again, we may not even be here to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Just my first question, if you could just take me back, I may have missed where this fit in, but you were talking about a policy, and the policy had the 7 elements. What exactly is that policy? Where would that fit in? You may have actually spoken to, I missed it, but it just wasn't in your written submissions. What is that policy referring to?
Yeah, go on.
The policy is a position paper that's been developed. If you have a look at the submission, it should be attached as an appendix to the submission. So it's not any sort of government policy or a piece of draft regulation, but it's a position paper linked to the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedom of Expression. But it's just a position paper drafted by the organisation.
Okay, thanks. I understand what you're referring to. Just on that, and the issue paper you refer to by the Association for Progressive Communications. So in here, I understand one of the big points is to say that access to the internet should be seen as a human right, or at least an enabler to human rights. I suppose the question is, do you think data and telecommunications more broadly are important enough to be considered a human right? I mean, on first read, it's a lofty claim, but maybe it's not, and we just want to expand on that to why it goes to the extent of a human right.
So the short answer is yes. If you look at the fact that the poor are prepared to spend so much of their precious cash on the ability and means to communicate, that talks about it. You know, if you want to look at it, so if you look at it on a fairly perverse basis of Maslow's triangle of basic needs, this is something that everyone wants to do. It's what makes us different as people, is our ability to communicate and the way and the importance of that communication. And given the development that we're experiencing and the rise of this fourth industrial revolution, or whatever terms we want to call it, just living in a digital world, it's now becoming something that is so fundamental to being able to exist that if you don't have it, your rights and your fundamental rights are deeply, and profoundly infringed. It'll soon be I would say it's only a matter of time. It's only 10 years later that we will need not just a basic TV aerial, but a box in order to decode signals so that hopefully you can get digital signal on your TV and interact with things. The ability for us, if we're serious about our constitution, our founding values are dignity and equality, if we're going to be any pretense at seriousness about addressing that, these issues have to be considered as part of our fundamental rights, simply because we cannot allow a situation where merely because you earn more money, you are able to get your children into better schools, you're able to access government, you're able to give your voice and then make sure that government hears your voice just because you're poor. So as government's e-services increase and improve, and hopefully they will across all of the parameters, unless this is seen as a basic facilitative right, all of those people, just because of their income status, are going to be left behind. Again, if we want to build a new apartheid, hundreds, let's go that way. Let's again bring in Donald Trump and we can do that kind of approach. If we're serious about inequality, it is that. But aside from those kind of reasons, in terms of our constitution, this is something that is gaining further international recognition. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Freedom of Expression has done a number of papers on exactly this issue, and it was them that really put this into the public discourse about access to the internet and therefore linking it to data and communications basically as being a new human right.
Thanks. My last question is just around, and there was a little bit more detail in your written submission about this Shika Moto and Shika Share systems, community Wi-Fi system that you mentioned. I just wanted to ask some more practical questions of, if you can just give a bit more detail on how it works and if there are any additional costs outside of the cost of the actual data. So I understand there'd be some Wi-Fi infrastructure, maybe some maintenance, but I can get a sense of what those additional costs are and what the savings are, if you can put any kind of numbers to it in that example, get a sense of what the extent of the benefit is.
So, I mean, there are a few. So there's the kind of direct costs, benefits, which is in money terms. So because we do things like make certain information available for free, in other words, so we downloaded an instance of Wikipedia. So for basic research, if people want to look up anything on Wikipedia, it's there and it's sitting on the network. So there's no actual cost to that. So the only cost to that is the cost of electricity on their phone for using it, right? When you look at the Shika Share system, and basically the way it works is that we put in a fairly robust unit. Again, you're not talking about places where the electricity is terribly reliable, so we're looking at some solar options, but even when it is reliable, you're not looking at people that necessarily have the skills to run a big, nice network room and have dedicated IT support there, etc. So you need a fairly rudimentary thing that can switch on and switch off, but that again you train people to use and operate, and that you put up nodes around that community. So currently we've got about 2 square kilometer area around where it's based, and anyone that's on that can jump on it and can message each other, and if they're on that they can message each other completely for free. But even that's going to come down. The way that the Shika Share system works is that it allows the organisation to buy data in bulk and to share that out for their users. Again, the systems that are there currently are built for people that are relatively wealthy. So most of us, I'm sure, in this room will be familiar with going to an airport or an internet cafe or something, and you want to use their Wi-Fi and they'll make you pay, and then you give your credit card number. The people that we work with in these communities don't have credit cards, so you've got to find a different way of doing that. We've got one that seems to be working. So the savings then are about how they save it within their community. So the people that's, and I mean, I don't know what they are, to be perfectly honest, in terms of, because we haven't gone and try to add those things up. I guess that we will, but what it does mean is that because we've been able to give an online database to people, it's saved them immeasurably in terms of their paperwork. So you save them time and effort, and you're giving them something that's more secure, and you're giving them new IT skills that they otherwise previously didn't have, etc., etc. So its indirect benefits and cost savings are immeasurable, but that's just because giving them fuller access to the internet.
Okay, thanks. That's all from my side.
I just want to explore the impact of zero rating as a possible solution in enhancing access. On page 15 of the paper that we have attached to the submission, there is table 3. I'm not sure whether you have.
Yes, we do have a
Yeah. Page 15, table 3, there is a table which shows some of the zero-rated services offered by SLC, Vodacom, and MTN. Some are fully zero-rated, and some are partially zero-rated, and those which are partially zero-rated, it seems as if only has some conditionalities in the sense that one must be on some paid operator plan package. So what has been the impact of, as far as you know, in terms of uptake of zero rating? So that's the first part of my question. And the second part is, how does one ensure that there is passed on to consumers of the benefit of zero rating? Because that is one of the criticisms of zero rating, that one cannot really pass on of zero rating to consumers.
So clearly that table needs to be updated because there are a number of things that are in there and others that aren't. So we know that MTN recently decided to cancel Twitter as a free service, and that's because it was costing too much money, because a lot of the content now is both visual and video intensive, and so I think it was just costing them too much. So in terms of the way you monitor it, I wouldn't have an idea. I think you'd have to ask the mobile operators that very good question. I think that's ideologically though, there's a problem with the zero rating, certain of these things, and we've seen this with ideas around Facebook Zero and with these other ideas. And it's, to be honest, to some degree, depending on the manner in which it's done, So I think that there's a legitimacy in saying that free services, in the same way that the state currently says you get free electricity and water up to a certain level for all people. The same should apply in this regard for provision of government services. That should be free and accessible. But the moment you start making some of these other things zero rated in the way that they appear to be, it's a bit like, okay, you're nice, we'll give you charity. I think that's a problematic assumption. We need to be saying, just because you're poor, your experience of the internet should not be any different to that of someone who is rich. It seems fairly perverse that you say, okay, because you're poor, no, you're not allowed to watch this video because it's going to cost us more money to deliver it to you. That seems quite patronizing and offensive. It should be, surely, that you say, you're a human being and you're in South Africa and you're having access to this. Your access must be determined on the same basis as whether you are very rich or whether you are very poor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Bate and Ms. Smith, for your time and for your presentation. You are excused. We will now take the next presentation from the Internet Service Providers Association. Gentlemen, and welcome. Please just take your name and set it for the record and then take the oath of office.
Good afternoon, Chair and other gentlemen. Thank you very much. My name is Dominic Cole, one of the regulatory advisors to the Internet Service Providers of South Africa. And I, Dominic Cole, affirm that the evidence that I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Afternoon, Chair. My name is Anton Kotze. I'm with Dominic, Regulatory Advisor to ISPA. And I, Anton Kotze, swear that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. It's been an interesting day, and it's been very interesting to see how certain themes are coming up over and over again. And during the course of this presentation, which is a little bit different from the ones which preceded it, ISPA is an industry body made up of operators, all of whom compete with each other. But notwithstanding that, you will see that there are certain parallels that you can draw between this presentation and much of what has been said earlier. And strangely enough, although it pains me to say this, you will also note when you hear Telkom present tomorrow that there are a number of parallels between this presentation and that given by Telkom. The short story, executive summary. In ISPA's view, there are clear indications of competitive failure in the market for wholesale mobile data services. We believe that intervention in this market, using established policy and legislative powers to facilitate competition and competitive pricing outcomes, will bring relief to the greatest number of users, and it will underpin inclusive socio-economic development. A great deal has been made and will be made, particularly tomorrow, of the complexity of the subject matter at hand. We wish to be at pains to draw a simpler narrative. There's a world of never-ending complexity that you can import into this exercise. We believe it's very important for the Commission to have a clear, simple narrative that it can stick to as it does its considerations and deliberations. One of the issues raised is around benchmarks. There's been a great deal of chit-chat, a multitude of proposed benchmarks, a multitude of proposed interpretations of benchmarks have been presented both to the Commission, in Parliament, to the ICASA, and spoken about in the media over the last 5 to 10 years as the cost to communicate has been a bigger and bigger issue. As ISPA, we can't offer you any assistance in reaching an evidence-based position. If anything, we would point you towards Research ICT Africa, which appears to be in the best position to offer that to the Commission. But we do believe, and this has been contemplated before, there was a body called the National Broadband Advisory Council, which was going to be established under an amendment to the Electronic Communications Act, which came into force in March 2014. And one of the tasks for that National Broadband Advisory Council was to establish some kind of benchmark which we could all rely on, which we could all refer to. Unfortunately, that process was never completed. That council was constituted but never actually sat and met. So this is still a problem we sit with, where we argue about what is the correct benchmark and what should we be looking at. The focus on benchmarks shouldn't obscure the fact that perceptions are incredibly important, and we are hearing consistently over the last decade about these perceptions, about how people feel that data must fall, about how aggrieved they are at the cost to communicate, about how it limits their rights and their abilities to use electronic communications. We note in particular when we talk about benchmarks that you've got to exercise caution when applying averages in a society which is as deeply unequal as South Africa. This is a point which has been raised a couple of times today, but just to give a very simple example, many of the benchmarks presented seem to assume that we have a room in which there are 10 people. 5 of them are 10 foot tall. 5 of them are 1 foot tall. And then we talk about an average of 5 to 6 feet, which is a person which doesn't actually exist in the current context. So just a note of caution there. And while we all argue about benchmarks and how useful they may or may not be in this current exercise, there is one thing which you've heard over and over and over again, and for which evidence has been presented, and it is not disputed, is that in South Africa, mobile data is more expensive for lower income groups. In the words of the Minister, spoken earlier this year, we have a strange market where it costs the poor more to access data than it costs the rich. This is a known issue. The Commission wants to know where should it focus. From ISPA's perspective, the answer is self-evident. It has been self-evident for a great deal of time. We believe that the focus must be on the market for wholesale mobile data in order to ensure greater competition in the downstream retail market and to stimulate better pricing outcomes in that downstream retail market. Again, self-evident, it was in March 2016 that the Minister of Telecommunications and Postal Services issued a policy directive to ICASA to say you must, as a matter of urgency, investigate and intervene in these broadband markets in order to ensure greater competition. Unfortunately, nothing has yet been done in that regard. Why should the focus be on mobile? Because we are a mobile country and we will remain a mobile country. It is our future. If you have a look at the Stats SA 2017 General Household Survey, we have given the detailed extracts in the written submission, then it's quite clear that we are mobile-centric and we're going to stay that way. Fixed line access is falling. The real standout figures from there is that in the province of Mpumalanga, 95.6% of the population can only access the internet or electronic communications through a mobile device. 94.8% for Limpopo, and not that much lower for all the other provinces in South Africa. It's a very small, very small percentage of people who have the option not to only be dependent on a mobile device and the mobile networks for their connectivity. Further, we know the government is engaged with many exercises around the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. We don't necessarily buy into the marketing, but there's definitely a process in terms of which the nature of work and the nature of society is evolving. It is again self-evident that the decisions we take now that we should have taken already regarding the affordability of mobile data services will have a direct impact on what kind of society we're going to have, on how people are skilled and equipped to deal with the change which is happening and which is coming. And more particularly, we've got decisions to make about, as we go to all these marketing terms, the fourth IR, 5G communications, are we heading for a society which is more or less inclusive? Because the danger exists as we roll out next generation infrastructure in the urban areas to people who can afford it, that those in the rural areas and those in the lower LSM groups who are already behind will simply fall further and further behind, and the digital divide will be entrenched. One of the arguments which came out in the written submissions from some of the operators submitted in November last year in the first round of submissions was to argue that the mobile data services markets are competitive, and to point rather at difficulties with spectrum constraints, which we'll address later, and the upstream fixed markets on which the mobile networks are dependent not being competitive. We couldn't disagree more strongly. We'll revisit the question of the mobile data services markets being competitive in a future slide, but for now to make the point that while the upstream market's backbone infrastructure, fixed infrastructure, is obviously critical in delivering mobile network services in South Africa, we have seen an absolute sea change in that industry over the last decade. We've seen Telkom's monopoly in international communications undersea cables fall away, with massive reductions in pricing as the Seacom cable came in, as the wax cable came in, and we now have almost an oversupply of international connectivity. The same is happening in national long distance. The same is happening in metro reticulation. The same is happening particularly in the deployment of fiber to the tower. So the mobile networks taking the steps that they need in order to handle growth in volume by ensuring that there is fixed line infrastructure going to their towers so that they can deal with increased volumes and increased demand. And while the mobile networks point to competitive failings, it's ironic that actually a lot of the competitive benefit which has been seen in those upstream fixed markets is as a result of the mobile networks themselves deploying national long distance or fiber networks. Another argument which the incumbent mobile networks offer, which we find completely disingenuous, is that it is difficult to establish the price of data where this is sold into the market as a part of a bundled service. And the quote there is from the Vodacom submission of the 17th November last year, which makes or tries to make the point that they don't put out data as a separate product, but they bundle it. Vodacom's active mainly in the mobile market as part of a bundle of voice, data, and messaging. We simply don't understand this. It's quite clearly and obviously possible for anyone in this room to buy data outside of it being bundled. If anyone in this room has children, they will know that their children don't come to them and say, "Mom, Dad, can I please have some airtime, or can I get some SMS credits?" It doesn't happen. The request is for data, pure and simple, nothing else. So we see these markets as being completely distinct and urge the Commission to take that position. The decision really to bundle the products in the way they have been bundled may have been valid some time ago, before the growth in the demand and popularity of data. But the decline in demand from consumers for voice and SMS is well established from the financial reports of the mobile networks and media. And it leads us to ask the question, well, is this kind of bundling in the interest of the consumer, or is it in the interests of the providers themselves? And interestingly enough, on Twitter yesterday, my broadband ran split the response from Mr. Michael Jordan, who is the founders and drivers behind RAIN, to be very interesting. Bundles shouldn't even exist. All RAIN customers pay the same 5 cents per megabyte, and there's no expiry or out-of-bundle shock. So here we have another operator focusing on data exclusively, which doesn't feel the need to adopt the same pricing methodologies and structures as the existing incumbent networks. And all power to them. It seems as if they are not going to be appearing here, but I would urge the Commission to investigate quite closely what the business model is that RAIN is pursuing. This issue of we sell bundles and there's no separate market for data is also being completely rejected by CASA and its priority markets in the electronic communications sector findings document, where it concludes that it is appropriate to consider retail mobile data or mobile broadband segment separately from the voice or the SMS segment. Any other interpretation, in our view, is artificial and simply at odds with the way in which we as South Africans these days demand and utilize these products. A related point, and one which is it's a point that we keep on having to make, is there's a perception that Vodacom and MTN, Cell C, Telkom Mobile for that matter, are mobile network companies. If you ask them, that's how they'll describe themselves. But their core business is increasingly selling access to the internet. That makes them an internet service provider. And if we define market provision as provision of access to the internet, then it is a hop, skip and jump to finding that certain companies who provide access to the internet are dominant. Who is the biggest ISP in South Africa? It's Vodacom. Also mention of over-the-top services, identified as a competitive restraint. It's very clear when it comes to mobile data. If we want to use more WhatsApp, if we want to use more over-the-top services, we have to get mobile data. So all of these things are actually driving demand. They're not constraints. OTTs, such as WhatsApp, may be a constraint on SMS, but quite frankly, all it's doing is taking into account a massive pricing gap which exists in the way in which the mobile networks actually put SMS into the market. Our understanding would be that the cost of an SMS to a mobile network is an absolute fraction of a cent. It's a fraction of a cent. But yet we're seeing retail prices of 40 cents, 80 cents out there in the market, making it literally the most expensive bandwidth on the planet. In such a circumstance, it's surprising that price-conscious consumers in South Africa turn to alternatives. No, it isn't. Then, looking at market concentration and competition issues as opposed to defining the markets, we've noted the Competition Commission's own research published earlier this year in one of its running paper series, and again 2 weeks ago, which looked at merger filings over the last decade in order to analyze which markets in South Africa are most concentrated, and coming to a conclusion that the ICT services market is far and away the most concentrated market. In our minds, this, and on the face of it at least, indicates a competitive failure. Again, Vodacom indicates in its written submission that it believes the market is competitive. MTN takes it a little further and says there is ferocious competition, no less in the mobile services data market, in the data services market. Again, we would just like to put some questions out there for the Commission to consider. If we look at competition in the fixed versus the mobile markets, how many service providers can you, as someone who's on Telkom's ADSL network, buy your data from? We don't have an exact figure, but it's in the region of 40 to 50. Okay, you can choose your AfriHost, you can choose your MWeb, your Web Africa, etc., etc., etc. The same absolutely applies to this new breed of open access fiber networks which are being deployed mainly in the urban centers in South Africa. There's a very clear focus on one network, and anyone who is connected to that network then has a choice of as many ISPs as are willing to sign up to that network service provider's non-discriminatory terms and conditions. So again, the residents sitting in a gated community or a business park will have a choice of 40 to 50 ISPs all competing with each other on the same network for the custom of everyone on that network. If we now take the position of Vodacom or MTN into contrast, how many ways do I have to buy data on Vodacom or MTN's network? While you consider that, also consider that 94, 95, 96% of people in a province may be solely dependent on those networks in order to access the internet. And a picture starts to emerge of the vast majority of people actually being corralled into purchasing data from a single provider which is vertically integrated. Then that position that this market is for mobile data services is competitive is completely at odds with a couple of recent events. So ICASA presented last week in Parliament on its latest tariff analysis. The diagram and the presentation is available to the Commission. It in no way reflects a competitive retail market for mobile data. We've seen Telkom Mobile in particular coming very aggressively with data packages, which has seen quite a shift of informed consumers onto that network, but it has made absolutely no difference to the pricing offered by MTN and Vodacom. The competition doesn't even touch them due to their dominance. And then this assertion that the wholesale or retail mobile data services market is competitive is of course directly at odds with the finding of ICASA's priority markets exercise, which came out and said we have 3 priorities in terms of markets, and one of those is the wholesale market and the retail market for mobile data services. So the regulator has found that these markets, on the face of it, and subject to a further investigation under Chapter 10 of the Electronic Communications Act, are in fact failing from a competitive sense. Another feature to look at is it's interesting that the Commission is seizing itself of this opportunity to look into the cost to communicate, into the cost of mobile data, to the cost of data in South Africa. And to us it indicates very clearly that bodies which may have their primary function as doing exactly that have simply failed to do so. ICASA has not in any way intervened in the market for data. It's tried with its so-called end-user subscriber service charter regulations, which will be in the High Court on the 14th and 15th of November, but there's no exercise of the pro-competitive powers which ICASA has under Chapter 10 of the Electronic Communications Act, which has been initiated in order to, follow on from the Minister's directive in March 2016 that these are priority markets in which there should be urgent intervention. The policymaker has not succeeded in creating a clear focused policy environment, although that may be changing. And it's quite clear that the incumbents only change behavior when forced to do so by commercial considerations or regulation. If ICASA hadn't come out with rules around rollovers and notifications, do you think that Vodacom and MTN would naturally have evolved to that position by themselves? History is littered with not necessarily anti-competitive, but certainly anti-consumer conduct, unless they are forced to act otherwise. And our regulatory functions, regulatory institutions and frameworks have failed us in this regard. Last point on that slide, the relative success of the one intervention in terms of Chapter 10 which ICASA has undertaken. So we go back to 2010 and we remember that there was massive political pressure around interconnection rates, which prompted ICASA to do an investigation, which they are continuing to this day in stages to take. And the intervention which ICASA made in the voice court termination markets has made a difference. So the exercise of powers under Chapter 10 is a tool and a remedy which is available to ICASA, which it has exercised in a particular vein, but is not exercising in perhaps the area which is most important to the majority of South Africans. I mentioned there may be more policy certainty emerging. We've seen recently an Electronic Communications Amendment Bill was introduced into the parliamentary process, and currently there is a proposed policy direction on licensing of unassigned high demand spectrum and the formation of a wireless open access network that's open for comment at the moment until the 8th of November. The Electronic Communications Amendment Bill that is in process. It's not clear at all with the general election coming next year when that will actually be finalized. But what we can see is flowing from the President's economic stimulus package announcement that there is a very real drive now on the part of DTPS to get the spectrum out there to relieve the constraints which the operators are going to detail tomorrow at length as being the reason why they can't reduce the price of mobile data. So hopefully that's coming. But in terms of the Commission's process, we as ISPA have been in a cycle of getting hopeful and being disappointed for years. This is how it works. We talk about open access, we used to talk about facilities leasing. It was the big thing that would change the market. And we all got very excited in 2010 in March when ICASA published final electronic communications facilities leasing legislation. There they were. Every licensee now had a right to go to an infrastructure provider and to request that they lease them facilities, and that infrastructure provider would be under an obligation to lease those facilities unless it was not technically or financially feasible to do so. Fast forward to 8 years later, the reality is that no one actually even bothers. Okay? We know that the incumbents will let you have access to facilities in areas where it is not a competitive concern to them. Where it is a competitive concern, suddenly it is no longer technically or economically feasible. You want to exercise and enforce your rights by going to ICASA to say, but I've got this right and they've got this obligation and they're not doing anything. ICASA is not going to resolve that dispute for you. It doesn't happen. They don't have the ability or the means to do so. So the history of implementation of the Act and the Electronic Communications Act, when it came into force in July 2006, was really heralded as being pro-competitive, whereas the Telecommunications Act, which had gone prior to that, was really about defending Telkom's position and Telkom's monopoly. The pro-competitive provisions in the ECA were really about protecting everyone else from Telkom. But we haven't seen we've seen very little of that actually materialize. And one of the things which is starkly missing from all these proposed policy directions and amendment bills is any initiative to reform ICASA or to ensure that ICASA actually has the ability to do what it is required to do or what it is empowered to do. There's talk of a new regulator, there's talk of things. That's all being shelved for now while we rush towards getting the spectrum out and getting the Electronic Communications Amendment Bill finalized. But we have no clear plan for dealing with the most important aspect of this, which is who enforces it, who regulates it, who makes sure that the rights which new competitors are given, which consumers are given, are actually enforceable. Another thing raised in some of the submissions was jurisdictional issues. Operators seek to caution the Commission to not attempt to preempt the work intended to be undertaken by ICASA. Again, there's an agreement in place between the Commission and the regulator in this regard. The arguments ignore the distinction between ex post and ex ante regulation, and further, we've quoted in our written submission from Section 4B of the ICASA Act as to how that position should be. And the question just occurring to me sitting here is, why is ICASA not presenting at these hearings or not involved in this process? We see DTPS is here, we see political parties are here, but the regulator, which is partially mandated to act in the consumers' interest in terms of electronic communications is absent.
Yeah, just to clarify, they are here, but please a representative from council.
They're not presenting?
They will be presenting on Friday.
Okay, my apologies to the regulator in that respect specifically. I see the regulator. To conclude, 2 slides on what is to be done. Again, to us it's a self-evident truth, it's a simple truth which has been out there and which people have recognized for some time, we just simply haven't done anything about it. We submit that the Commission's recommendations reference intervention in the wholesale market for mobile data through pro-competitive measures designed to impose obligations on dominant providers to offer wholesale open access. Again, we struggle from an ISP perspective. While we can go and compete on the fixed networks, we can't go and compete on the mobile networks. It's simply not open to us. It's not allowed. We would look at effecting functional separation for vertically integrated incumbents to underpin those wholesale open access obligations. Again, this has been raised by a number of presenters today, and it's very much part of where we're going from a policy perspective in terms of telecommunications in this country. So if you look at the Electronic Communications Amendment Bill, which I referenced earlier, the provisions on open access contain specific provisions to deal with vertically integrated incumbents. They talk about COACAM, cost of account, and chart, I can't remember charts of account and cost allocation manuals, which would have to be undertaken in order to ensure some kind of transfer pricing and fairness in the way that Vodacom, the network, supplies services to Vodacom, the ECS, Vodacom, the ISP, and all the other ISPs in the market. And we believe that ultimately these interventions were to stimulate competition in the downstream market. Why do we think that's important? Because we've seen what competition in the downstream market has done in the fixed networks. Telkom's ADSL, you used to be able to get 3 gigs and your gig would cost you 150 Rand. Sound familiar? These days you're getting, with all the competition on Telkom's ADSL network, you're getting prices as low as 50 cents a gig. Okay, you're getting massive innovation, you're getting uncapped products. All of that is simply a product of competition which has been allowed to take place on the fixed network of Telkom, and the contrast with the Vodacom and MTN's network where that competition has not been allowed could not be more glaring. There are a number of things that already point in this direction. So the paper on market concentration, which we referenced, talks about promoting the use of structural remedies for anti-competitive offences of collusion and exclusion. The experience of the Commission and Competition Tribunal in addressing Telkom's conduct as a result of complaints initiated by ISPA and others back in 2001, 2002. And it's fascinating to read Telkom's submission, which, as much as they may have protested and been extremely unhappy about the fines and the settlements which were imposed on them, they now are of an opinion that it was a really good thing for them. And they took the functional separation which was imposed on them, and they've taken it a step further to structural separation, because they can see the benefit for doing so, and they can see the broader benefit for the country in them doing so. We've taken note of the provisions of the Competition Amendment Bill. We're not sure what powers the Commission has in terms of outcomes of this process, but we can see quite clearly that there's a process for the Commission to aggregate further powers to itself in order to actually be able to take meaningful action, and we support that. And I think I will leave it there, unless Mr. Kotza has anything to add.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation again. Just on your first point where you were questioning us against using averages in society with economic inequality. So there is 2 questions on that point that you made earlier on. The first question is, what does this mean for South Africa and benchmarking studies? And 2, how do we practically take question of the fact that South Africa is a society with deep economic inequality?
Again, we as ISPA, we're not an organization which has gone out and done extensive benchmarking and comparative analysis, but we've seen a lot of what has been presented. And a lot of what has been presented is benchmarking us against countries which don't have the same kind of Gini coefficient or deep inequality which South Africa has. So we would immediately question the drawing of parallels. Okay? And we know particularly that in South Africa we need to focus on those who don't have access. We need to focus on the 50%, which were pointed out in Mr. Harrison's slide earlier, who have no economic power. Because it's quite clearly a policy of government to be as inclusive as possible, not exclusive. So it's just a note to say that interrogate the figures which are presented. Because often those figures come from a jurisdiction which doesn't have the same kind of features and same priorities as we do here.
Okay, that's fine. And then the next question relates to your submission that you gave with regards to this public hearing. And I would like to refer you to paragraph 7.5.2, where you are considering submission made by Vodacom that mobile markets are competitive and fixed market are not, while the lack of competition in fixed is still affecting mobile as an input into mobile. And then your submission is that you state that Vodacom is conflating upstream and downstream markets, comparing the upstream market for fixed infrastructure use as an input in the provision of mobile data services with downstream markets providing access to mobile data services. Can you just perhaps explain this to us in more detail?
Thank you. I think in order to do that, it's necessary to go into Vodacom's submission and the words which they used. And they talk about noting in the mobile market in which the largest part of Vodacom's business falls, and then there's a redacted portion. Its customers make use of offerings that combine voice messaging, SMS, and data. Proper investigation, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, no. Vodacom is saying, broadly speaking, that they're of the view that data is sold within three main markets, namely the mobile retail market, the fixed retail broadband internet access market, and the leased line internet access market. They talk about the allegation that data prices are high must be viewed within the competitive dynamic of the relevant markets within which data is sold. Okay, and let's talk about those relevant markets according to Vodacom. Those are access markets. So they talk about different means in terms of which we as consumers make that first mile or last mile connection. Is it mobile? Is it fixed? Is it satellite? Is it fixed wireless? What does that mean? So those are all retail markets that are being referred to. They then continue that where the markets are competitive, economic theory dictates that price outcomes will be competitive. Vodacom submits that the mobile market in which data is sold is competitive. However, the fixed markets are uncompetitive. Which markets are they referring to when they say fixed markets? Are they talking about telecom, ADSL, or fiber? Because there is no intimation or factual basis to say that any of those markets which are comparable to the mobile data retail market are in fact uncompetitive. So what we're saying in that submission is that they are taking a downstream retail market and attempting to compare it to upstream input markets into their own mobile data and saying that those are not competitive. And we'd like to think that through our written submission and the presentation we pointed out that that is something we disagree with quite strongly.
Can I just draw an analogy to try and explain in different words what Dominic has just said? If I was to run a courier company, my service is to move a parcel from point A to point B. I would necessarily have to use the roads network. What we have in South Africa is that the incumbent networks own the road networks and they own the courier service. Now when we talk about internet access, the parallel is the courier service. And the network over which internet access is provided is the roads network. So what Vodacom is saying in this section that we're discussing is that what you've got to do is define a market for provincial roads and municipal roads. And they miss the fact that what we are complaining about and what the inquiry is about and what the public interest is about is the fact that we are actually talking about the courier service, the cost of the courier service. And the more people have access, more courier companies have access to the roads network, the cheaper the courier service can become, the more innovation we can get in the courier services. And that's what we mean when we say there's a conflation between upstream and downstream. Is that what they're taking is the actual physical type of network and making an issue out of that as opposed to the service that's provided on top of that network.
Okay, I think it's clear now. The next question, in your presentation you have clearly indicated that you don't think that the mobile market is competitive. And I think you mentioned some of the reasons why that might be the cause. Over and above what you mentioned, what are the other causes that you can perhaps explain to us that make you come to the conclusion that the mobile market is not competitive?
It's perhaps a question which would be done justice by a supplementary answer. Between the two of us, let's see what we can do. There's clearly an entrenched advantage to two networks which were established in 1993, which were given essentially the keys to make a great deal of money through effectively a duopoly over mobile services in South Africa, with particular reference to the spectrum which they were given. So at the beginning there's an entrenched advantage. Okay, we know that when Cell C came into the market, we know that when Telkom Mobile came into the market, these were interventions which were said to going to introduce great competition in terms of data, voice and SMS, and we would question whether Cell C's entrance, whether Telkom Mobile's entrance has in fact constrained the mobile networks in terms of their the Vodacom and MTN in terms of their competitive conduct at all. The question's particularly broad, so there's structural reasons. There's the fact that these are dominant entities in the market. They've got all the infrastructure and they've invested the money to maintain that advantage and to keep that advantage. And I want to be clear that, you know, from an ISPA perspective, we've got a lot to say about Vodacom and MTN. But we recognize the centrality of those mobile networks to South Africa's future. There's talk now of a wireless open access network to come in and to create this competition. So government clearly agrees with this. It's saying we don't have enough service level competition, and we're going to introduce fundamental structural changes to the market. We're going to license a wireless open access network. We're going to give it spectrum. Why? Because we need to do something about the dominance of two particular companies.
And then the next question, I think it also relates to what you said earlier on, but I want to bring you to your recent submission on paragraph 7.5.5, where you say that you're not sure on what basis it is claimed that there's a failure of competition in this mixed market, as pricing for the supply of traditional and long distance connectivity has declined sharply as a result of greater competition. There's some information there in the bracket. So what we have been told by some ISPs is that they actually think that the market, the fixed market, is not competitive, at least the wholesale market. And the premise of that is that they're saying that the IP Connect product is excessively priced. So how does this work with your view that the fixed market in South Africa is competitive? And two, they've also said, this ISPs, that the wholesale market, fixed market, is dominated by one firm. So we just want to get your views on that. And the last question is saying, does this decline sharply necessarily imply that the market is competitive? And this part I'm referring to on 7.5.5.
I'm going to try to feel my way through that question. So the allegations perhaps raised in respect of a lack of competition at the wholesale level is because traditionally there's only been one fixed market. Okay? But those allegations are then saying, well, the problem is the monopoly at the network service level, at the upstream services level. And first thing to note is that that is changing dramatically. Telkom is no longer the dominant provider of fixed line connections. We're seeing massive growth, and a lot of that is actually coming from Vodacom, MTN, Cell C, in terms of fixed connections and fixed connectivity, which they're putting into the market. So my options as an ISP are constantly increasing in terms of the networks which I can use. And again, you know, to go back to the analogy from my colleague, we're talking about the couriers. And the point we're making is that on Telkom's roads, there are 50 to 60 to 100 couriers. On Vodacom's or MTN's roads, there are maximum 1, perhaps 2 or 3 couriers which can be used. So if there's a complaint that the market isn't competitive because Telkom controls an essential facility, and through the IPC pricing, which has reduced dramatically, both as a function of the Commission's work and of Telkom's, you know, shift towards recognizing that it's a volumes-based company. We don't see what's being raised there as counter to what we're actually bringing to the Commission in terms of the difference between the fixed and mobile markets. There's a massive amount of competition for the services of consumers on a fixed network. It's absent in a mobile network.
I'd just like to add to Dominic that the IPC product is but only one single product in a much broader range of products in the fixed line market. It's often for a specific road network, if we want to keep with that technology, the only product. But in the fixed line market, specifically with the deployment of fiber optic networks, the road networks and the choices for service providers have become a lot more. So when we make the statement, we're talking about the broader fixed line market, not one component.
And one further addition, at least in the fixed line market, there is an IPC product.
The next question, I'm also going to point you to your submission in paragraph 8.2.4, where you state that it is interesting to know, when considering the answers to whether the mobile market is competitive, the percentage of population served by the mobile network as opposed to the percentage serviced over fixed networks. So there's two questions that I have in relation to this statement. The first one is that there is difference in coverage, not in fact suggests that there's a historical problem with the fixed market that the coverage is so low, and two, is this not evidence of a competition concern given that the coverage in the fixed market is so low?
Thank you. I think it's evidence that there are different kinds of networks. So a fixed network requires a fixed connection into a property. It's far easier to get national population coverage through a mobile network because it's using spectrum and there's wireless coverage, etc., etc. And we know that the mobiles have 99.6 population coverage. That would never be available to a fixed network. You can't put a fixed line into 99.6% of the population's homes or businesses. So that simply doesn't work. And I think the point we're trying to make here is that if we hypothetically say that fixed service providers service 10% of the South African market and mobiles service exclusively 90%, then if we take that to the service level, we see that there are 50 to 100 service providers competing for that 10%. But there's a complete failure of service level competition for the balance of the 90%.
Just to the point on the type of network, I can tell you now that fixed networks cover 100% of the population. Because satellite is a form of fixed network and it covers 100% of the country. But just to point to the point that the population coverage is really about the type of network, not about the competitiveness.
And then the last question from my side is that as one of your recommendations, you're recommending that the dominant providers of postal data should offer services on open access on their network on a non-discriminatory basis. So the question is that why is open access only forced on permanent provider? I think you touched on it earlier on, but maybe just to get more clarity in this regard.
In terms of government policy, it's not only enforced on incumbent providers, it's a broad application. At the lowest level, if you look at the Electronic Communications Amendment Bill and its representation of policy in terms of draft legislation, it's quite clear that the open access obligation applies to all licensees. Okay, but we take note that not all licensees are equal. And we take note that there may be licensees which are in a dominant position which need specific treatment. We take note that specifically there are licensees which are vertically integrated. And the issue of open access becomes particularly important where there's vertical integration. The Commission's experience with Telkom indicates this. Okay, we knew that in licensing terms you get two main forms of service license: an electronic communications network service license, an ECNS, and an electronic communications service license, an ECS. A company like Vodacom has an ECNS and an ECS. Telkom has an ECNS and an ECS. One of the open access fiber providers, let's take an example of Umitel, actually only has an ECNS license. So to start looking at that, what is an ECNS? What is the licensed right which you get from holding an ECNS license? It is the right to sell or make capacity available on your network to yourself or to a third party. Okay, so Umitel holding an ECNS license means that when it's deployed its optic fiber network, it now has the right to say, right, this network is live, there's capacity available on it, I can now sell that network either to myself, which I choose not to do because I don't want to compete at the service layer, or they can sell it to any third party which wants to come and then compete on their network, which is exactly what they do. So you get all the service providers, including a Vodacom, including MTN, including Cell C, including Telkom, all competing at the ISP level on Umitel's network. We can see quite clearly the distinction between the ECNS and the ECS. When the Commission first started engaging with Telkom, it was impossible to distinguish between where was the ECNS and where was the ECS. Okay, and part of the Commission's work with Telkom and the functional separation and the later structural separation was to say, right, we now have an entity called OpenServe. That's where our ECNS sits. That is the entity which sells capacity on the Telkom network. Telkom Retail BCX, those operate at the service level using the Telkom ECS license. So now, post all of that, when I look at Telkom, I can see, right, there's the ECNS door and there's the ECS. And the Commission went further and said, we need to ensure that Telkom, the ECNS OpenServe, acts in a non-discriminatory manner to those it makes capacity available to on its network. So if A, B, and C come to Telkom, to OpenServe, and let's say A is Web Africa, B is MWeb, and C is Telkom Retail BCX, we need, as the Commission, to put mechanisms in place around transfer pricing, etc., to make sure that they're all getting the same deal. OpenServe as an ECNS is not discriminating unfairly amongst those who come and seek to take capacity out. When I now look at Vodacom or MTN, it takes me back to where I cannot distinguish between where the ECNS starts and stops and where the ECS is. When Vodacom as a network makes capacity available on its network to its retail arm, is it doing so on the same terms and conditions as it may be to third parties? Absolutely not. That's the distinction.
So just a couple follow-ups from my side. So just one thing I want to drill down into is this question of competitiveness and fix that we've been dealing with a little bit, but I think we can all very much understand and see that there's extensive competition in the retail space within fix, so it's ISPs who have got ECS licenses who are competing against each other. Is it still, just to drill down, is it still your position that at a wholesale level in fix that it's competitive?
Yes, in terms of the existing choice. Okay, and again, I'm going to take a slight detour here. In terms of the white paper on ICT policy and in terms of the Electronic Communications Amendment Bill, where we're moving to as a country in terms of policy is to say we don't need to duplicate infrastructure. Okay? Infrastructure as a competitive basis is no longer, or as a competitive differentiator is no longer necessary. If we go back to 1993, we see, and we look around now, we see that often where there is a mobile mast, there'll be another one right next to it, because the mobile networks needed to differentiate based on coverage. It's no longer a factor. Now it's about sharing at the infrastructure level. And policy and the draft bill actually recognize that. So they have provisions that say, if you come in, and let's take the example of a fiber operator, and you connect up this business park so that everyone in this business park is able to find themselves in any point of your network, they can receive connectivity through it, then you will be referred to as the primary licensee. And that business park, that precinct, will be referred to as adequately served. Okay? And the implication here is that you as the network provider, you will receive protections from the law in terms of others coming in to put in infrastructure, to duplicate that infrastructure. And that protection is predicated upon you being open access at layer 3 and allowing ISPs to compete with your network. So that is precisely where we're going, into that situation where it's okay to have a single network. Quite bluntly, you are never going to reach full capacity on a fiber network. There's no need to duplicate. Maybe redundancy in certain circumstances if you're dealing with banks and critical infrastructure. But the critical point is, actually, you're going to be protected in your network investment as long as you are open access and allow competition to the benefit of all the people in that precinct. Not a situation where you come in and say, right, I have the network, I'm also signing an exclusivity agreement, which means that I am the only person who can now sell internet access and voice over my network, which is what still happens in gated communities and precincts when certain providers go in there.
Okay, right. So you're saying if you have open access, you're saying in fixed markets you've got open access at the level 3. But does that guarantee that you've got competitive outcomes if you don't have open access above that, or some kind of level of competition above that level? So I understand that you're saying in mobile you don't have open access at the so-called level 3. That's right? But as in fixed you do have that, but there's still a couple levels above that. So I'm just trying to understand whether, because some of the submissions we've received would say that at levels above level 3 and fixed, you've still got areas of the market, maybe not the whole market, but areas of the industry, let's say that, where it's telecom and telecom alone. The one specific area is where ISPs have told us that it's this IP Connect product and there's no alternative for them. So in that sense, and I don't have to, I suppose we're not trying to convince you, it's more trying to understand, but when we see that area of the market at least as not necessarily competitive because we don't see alternatives for an ISP. Perhaps that makes it clearer so we can get closer to each other.
So I'll take this one. The fact that anybody with a correct service license can conclude an IPC contract with Telkom and go and compete with Telkom on Telkom's ADSL network has already shown great benefits, and we can see the historic trends. It does not mean to say that that is already a perfect situation and we don't need to maybe look at any other interventions. But what we're saying is the fact that it's open to procure a network service and to compete even with the network operator himself has already shown huge benefits. Benefits which we to date has not, we haven't seen that on any of the mobile networks.
I'm sorry, just to one further point. Where does the IPC come from? It comes from, it originally comes from 1999 to 2001 and Telkom claiming exclusivity of internet protocol of all IP traffic, which would have been an extremely bad outcome for the country. So So there was opposition to that fights, and eventually a settlement brokered by CASA, which resulted in the IPC product. At that stage, the ISP community was very happy to get something. But even at that stage, there was a recognition that Telkom had intentionally broken that wholesale product. It made it as difficult as possible. So no, it's not an optimal solution, but it is an indicator of the potential of what can happen where even if the bar is set too high and one input is too high, everyone's getting the same problem.
Okay, now the point is well taken. I think we're all closer to each other in understanding it. The next question is maybe more a factual question, but as an association of ISPs, I understand if you are offering an ADSL product to a customer, that ADSL product is always going to be using the IP Connect product. It's always going through Telkom at some level of the chain that you offer as the end part of the chain. For your fiber contracts, where you're offering as ISPs, offering a fiber product to a residential or business customer, perhaps that's where the difference is, but where you're offering a fiber product, is that product ever, and excuse the lack of technical terminology, but is that fiber product in our country ever skipping out Telkom altogether? Or they always be available, also always be involved at some point?
So in Dominic's style, I'm going to take a bit of a detour. The roads network, the fixed line roads, we'll call that the layer 2 network, the network operator, using the ECNS license. The layer 3, the ISP, the courier company moving the data, that's the ECS licensing, also as a network. We get logical networks, we get physical networks. But the logical and the physical network need to interconnect. So when the service provider competing in the retail market necessarily has to connect with the network operator. So if it's the network operator is not Telkom, then Telkom will be skipped completely because they just simply won't be in the equation. On the IP Connect, you must remember there's two parts to this as well. The one part is the actual interconnection of the network. So somewhere Telkom's copper network needs to hand over to the ISP's network. But there's also a component of internet access that often can be bought from Telkom, but it's not necessary. And one must just also remember that those two are different services, often under the same name because they're different flavors of the same product. But in terms of the fiber networks, to answer your question shortly, there will be an interconnect of the networks between the ISP and the network operator. From there on, where they buy their internet access, they may peer at peering points themselves, or they may then go and buy from a Telkom or a Liquid or any other upstream service provider, providing them with wholesale internet access. And again, there's a choice of myriad of service providers.
And just touching again on the question about competition in the upstream fixed markets and tying into this question. Used to be, leaving aside questions about IPC, you couldn't avoid Telkom because they were the only people who could get you from South Africa to anywhere else in the world. Yeah. Then that was resolved. Then it was a problem of, well, Telkom had the only national long distance network in South Africa. So you couldn't avoid them because you'd have to buy NLD from them. Or take it to the next level, you'd have to buy metro reticulation from them to get around a large city. It's no longer the case. I've now got choice in terms of those providers for international connectivity, for national long distance, and for metro reticulation, and increasingly I'm now getting choices in terms of which provider I'm using for my network, my fixed network, be it a Vumatel, Broadband, Optitel, Telkom, Liquid, Vodacom, and MTN, Cell C, whoever it is.
Alright, thanks. And the last question for me is, you made a comment around what was formerly facilities leasing and is now open access in the sort of ECA bill. And you said that because of the regulator couldn't resolve disputes there to get people access or to get licensees access to facilities. And I suppose the question was, and I can't remember the words you used, but they were suggesting that something needed to change with CASA. And I just wanted to understand from your perspective, is the problem here something policy or legislative orientated, or is it a resourcing issue? Where are you seeing the problem that ICASA is not able to resolve these disputes that you say they're not able to resolve?
I think ICASA's difficulties go far broader than not being able to resolve disputes. So I would also tie a lack of interventions under Chapter 10, many false starts which have taken place over the years, handsets, set subsidy regulations which have never seen the light of day. It goes on. And it's not to be ICASA bashing, because the simple reality is that from an ISPA perspective, if we want things to change, we need the status quo to change. And if we want the status quo to change, we need the regulator's assistance in changing it. But the fact of the matter is that since the IBA and SATRA, the South African Telecommunications Regulatory Authority, merged in 2000, if you go back to 2000, you will find news reports stating from them as to the lack of resources and capacity available to ICASA. There's a degree of sabotage from government. There's been suspicion of at least notionally independent regulator. We recognize that ICASA is doing many things to try and resolve this. I would point to its graduate development program in particular as being an excellent example of trying to get young professionals and expertise in. But perhaps when the Commission engages with ICASA, you should inquire as to how many engineers there are, how many economists there are, how many professional people there are to take on the Vodacoms and the MTNs of the world in dealing with an issue like mobile data. And the answer will be shocking, because they're very, very few. And that has to be resolved before ICASA is actually in a position and empowered to do the work that we as ISPA certainly wanted to do.
Okay, thanks. And just the last follow-up on that is, so do you feel like there's any legislative shortcoming that inhibits or prevents ICASA from doing its work? I've taken all your points, but legislatively, or the power that they have in terms of the ICASA Act, is your feeling that it is sufficient and the changes that are coming, or is there a shortcoming just from your experience?
I think generally the legislative framework is sufficient. It can always be simplified. I think issues have had more to do with the interaction with the policymaker, issues of political will. And I think this is going to be very much in the forefront as we go forward now. If we look at the policy direction on high demand spectrum and the absolute urgency of the mobile networks and others to get their hands on more spectrum. So we know this. We know that an announcement has come out that we want to hold a spectrum auction by the end of April next year in order to put unassigned high demand spectrum out and to license this wireless open access network. Who does the majority of that work fall to? It falls to the regulator. And as we get more and more desperate to actually see some real progress in terms of getting spectrum out there and in terms of these outcomes, we're going to recognize more and more that the regulator is central to this, and it is currently not in a position to actually discharge that mandate. So there has been an initiative to say we're going to replace the regulator. We're going to make it into a super economic regulator. We're talking about an ICT sector commission and tribunal bill, which was going to be put before Parliament this year, but now isn't. And the reason it isn't is because we know we don't currently have the time to reform ICASA in that way, because we need it to be acting now to license out the spectrum, etc., etc. So we're going to find ourselves in a bit of a crunch. It's very difficult to say that if one of the powerful incumbent doesn't like an outcome from ICASA, it's going to be very difficult to say, well, we don't think that there isn't a gap you can take, or a procedural irregularity, or something that hasn't been complied with, because again and again we see that. Data rollover, we're still in court. Voice call termination, we go into court again and again and again. Spectrum issues, we've been in court. And if the regulator is not in a position to do its job, that's simply where we're going to find ourselves again.
Thank you.
I just want to explore your intervention that you have proposed in paragraph 10 of your written submission, which is an intervention directed at wholesale market for mobile data. And you propose two things there. Firstly, you propose a consideration, or that consideration be given to imposing obligations on dominant providers of wholesale mobile data services to offer wholesale open access to their networks on a non-discriminatory basis. Secondly, you propose a functional separation for vertically integrated incumbents to support wholesale open access obligations. My first question is, in relation to the first proposal, 10.1.1, your proposal seems to be suggesting that there is a form of discriminatory provision of wholesale access, because you are proposing that that be offered on a non-discriminatory basis.
I think it's a little bit blunter than that. With respect to discrimination is that you offer it to yourself, but you don't offer it to anyone else.
Sorry, just to
Yeah.